I guess, the Derek Chauvin trial started. They began jury selection. Unfortunately, well, I don't know if it's unfortunate or not, but anyone who's ever like been to court or in any way knows that this shit is insanely boring and monotonous. So that's just about over. But there's protests happening all around, so reassuring. Um, okay, so I actually listened to the Punch Out from Breakthrough News, which is a great podcast on Spotify. Um, they release an episode every day, basically, and they cover like pivotal events. So I really recommend people um, listening to that because it gives you a principled perspective on a plethora of international issues. Today, they talked about the Philippines and the mass executions of communists that's currently going on under the guise of like the war on drugs. And things of that nature. They talked about a student-led protest in Johannesburg, South Africa. I think it's Johannesburg, but it is South Africa, where the students are leading a protest and getting met with brutal repression by the police there. So yeah, I listen to that literally every day before I go live. So yeah, so that's why I started like a minute or two late because I wanted to wrap that up. Listening to that, it's definitely a valuable resource. So today we are reading Rosa Luxemburg, um, who was a revolutionary communist. Um, I'm just going to Marxist.org right now. So if you want to, read along or whatever, again, Marxists with an S at the end .org. Just Google that or put it in your search browser, whatever one you use, and yeah, it'll pop right up. It's free, very easily accessible, and this was written. I guess part of it was written in 1900 and part of it was written in 1908. Rosa, I believe, lived from 1887 to 1919. I might not be right on her birth date, but she died. She was murdered, basically, by Democrats in 1919. Um, and this pamphlet she wrote has quite the reputation. And we're going to delve into it. Already, I'm looking at the introduction, and I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce a lot of these German words that get used on rare occasion, it seems. But yeah, as always, you can, if you have a question for me, you can tag me on Twitter, and I will pull my Facebook up and try to keep an eye on that. But it's not always reading easy. I don't have two monitors just yet, so sometimes I miss comments, and I do apologize for that. On the bright side, the timeline to get my equipment from Washington, D.C. has moved up significantly and should be early next month. So hopefully, yeah, while I'll have more than one monitor so I can, manage things a bit better. Okay, so Reform or Revolution by Rosa Luxemburg. Introduction. At first view, the title of this work may be found surprising. Can the social democracy be against reforms? Can we contrapose the social revolution, the transformation of the existing order, our final goal, to social reforms? Certainly not. The daily struggle for reforms, for the I don't know this word, amelioration. Okay, we're gonna Google, like, I hate to have to Google things in the first like 5 fucking seconds, but I don't even know if I've seen this word before, so we gotta Google amelioration, or however the fuck you say this. The act of making something better, improvement.
Amelioration.
Amelioration. That's how you say that. Amelioration. Okay, so we'll start over, whatever. At first view of the title of this work may be found surprising. Can the social democracy be against reforms? Can we contrapose the social revolution, the transformation of the existing order, our final goal, to social reforms? Certainly not. The daily struggle for reforms, for the amelioration of the conditions of the workers within the framework of the existing social order, and for democratic institutions, offers to the social democracy the only means of engaging the proletarian class war and working in the direction of the final goal, the conquest of political power and the suppression of wage labor. Between social reforms and revolution, there exists for the social democracy an indissoluble tie. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution, its aims. I think I know what indissoluble means, but I'm going to Google it anyways for those who don't. Indissoluble is an adjective, unable to be destroyed, elastic.
Indissoluble.
Indissoluble. Okay, great. So, the conquest of political power and the suppression of wage labor. Continuing, between social reforms and revolution, there exists for the social democracy an indissoluble tie. The struggle for reforms is its means, the social revolution, its aims. It is Edward Bernstein's theory, presented in his articles on Problems of Socialism, German word, Neue Zeit, of 1897 to 98, and in his book, Die Voraussetzungen des Sozialismus und die Aufgaben der Sozialdemokratie. Something about, something. Social democrats, fucking people. That we find for the first so in Edwards, it's referencing this dude's book, that we find for the first time the opposition of the two factors of the labor movement. His theory tends to counsel us to renounce the social transformation, the final goal of social democracy, and inversely to make social reforms. The means of the class struggle, its aim. Bernstein himself has very clearly and characteristically formulated this viewpoint when he wrote, quote, "The final goal, no matter what it is nothing. The movement is everything." Oh, I like that. Kind of. But since the final goal of socialism constitutes the only decisive factor distinguishing the social democratic movement from the bourgeois democracy and from bourgeois radicalism, the only factor transforming the entire labor movement from a vain effort to repair the capitalist order into a class struggle against this order for the suppression of this order, the question, quote, reform or revolution, as it is posed by Bernstein, equals for the social democracy the question to be or not to be. In the controversy with Bernstein and his followers, everybody in the party ought to understand clearly it is not a question of this or that method of struggle or the use of this or that set of tactics, but of the very existence of the social democratic movement. Upon a casual consideration of Bernstein's theory, this may appear like an exaggeration. Does he not continually mention the social democracy and its aims? Does he not repeat again and again in very explicit language that he too strives towards the final goal of socialism, but in another way? Does he not stress particularly that he fully approves of the present practice of the social democracy? This is all true, to be sure. It is also true that every new movement, when it first elaborates its theory and policy, begins by finding support in the preceding movement. Though it may be in direct contradiction with the latter, it begins by suiting itself to the forms found at hand, and by speaking the language spoken hereto. In time, the new grain breaks through the old husk. The new movement finds its forms and its own language. I'm going to pause briefly so I can monitor things happening. Okay. Continuing, to expect an opposition against scientific socialism at its very beginning, to express itself clearly, fully, into the last consequence of the subject of its real content, to expect it to deny openly and bluntly the theoretic basis of the social democracy would amount to underrating the power of scientific socialism. Today, he who wants to pass as a socialist and at the same time declare war on Marxian doctrine, the most stupendous product of the human mind in the century, must begin with involuntary esteem for Marx. So basically, I think what she's saying there is, even if you try to shit on Marx and come out against him in whatever way, because of the sort of totality of the ideas and the universality of the ideas Marx presented, that whoever is doing that inherently has a degree of respect for Marx. And you can see that even today. Even on Wall Street, people are, and even Wall Street, the political consultants, the economists, they all cite Marx and his labor theory of value, amongst other things. They just, they're not really Marxists. They just understand that Marx presented science in a true form. So continuing, he must begin by acknowledging himself to be his disciple, by seeking in Marx's own teachings the point of support for an attack on the latter, while he represents this attack as a further development of Marxian doctrine. On this account, so people who come out against Marx are just making false attempts at advancing his doctrine. On this account, we must, unconcerned by its outer forms, pick out the sheathed kernel of Bernstein's theory. This is a matter of urgent necessity for the broad layers of the industrial proletariat in our party. No coarser insult, no baser aspersion can be thrown against the workers than the remarks, quote, "theocratic controversies are only for academicians." End quote. Some time ago, Lassalle said, "Only when science and the workers, these opposite poles of society, become one, will they crush in their arms of steel all obstacles to culture." Oh, what a great quote. Wow. The entire strength of the modern labor movement rests on theoretic knowledge. But doubly important is this knowledge for the workers in the present case, because it is precisely they and their influence in the movement that are in the balance here. It is their skin that is being brought to market. The opportunist theory in the party, the theory formulated by Bernstein, is nothing else than an unconscious attempt to assure predominance to the petty bourgeois elements that have entered our party, to change the policy and aims of our party in their direction. The question of reform or revolution, of the final goal and the movement, is basically, in another form, but the question of the petty bourgeois or proletarian character of the labor movement. It is, therefore, in the interest of the proletarian masses of the party to become acquainted actively and in detail with the present theoretic knowledge remains the I'm going to restart this paragraph, sorry. It is, therefore, in the interest of the proletarian mass of the party to become acquainted actively and in detail with the present theoretic knowledge remains the privilege of a handful of academicians in the party. The latter will face the danger of going astray only when the great mass of workers take the keen and dependable weapons of scientific socialism in their hands, will all the petty bourgeois inclinations, all the opportunistic currents come to naught. The movement will then find itself on sure and firm ground. quantity will do it. And that is the introduction to Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution. Now, before I continue with the next sorry, I got a funny notification. Before I continue with the next part, I just want to issue a broad disclaimer. I have not read this book before. I've heard great things about it. So if I stop and I'm like, whoa, that's fucking awesome, that's why. Because, really, only when science and the workers, these opposite poles of society, become one, will they crush in their arms of steel all obstacles to culture. That is just such a fantastic quote, and so true. So continuing to Chapter 1, the Opportunist Method. Okay. Part 1, Chapter 1, the Opportunist Method. It is true that theories are only the images of the phenomena of the exterior world in the human consciousness. I'm going to read that again because it's a load. If it is true that theories are only the images of the phenomena of the exterior world in the human consciousness, it must be added, concerning Edward Bernstein's system, that theories are sometimes inverted images. Think of a theory of instituting socialism by means of social reform in the face of the complete stagnation of the reform movement in Germany. Now, just a reminder, this happened prior to World War II. This was written in 1900. Think of theory of trade union control. Consider a theory of winning a majority in Parliament. After the revision of the Constitution of Saxony in the view of the most recent attempts against universal suffrage, however, the pivotal point of Bernstein's system is not located in his conception of practical tasks of social democracy. It is found in his hand on the course of the objective development of capitalist society, which, in turn, is closely bound to his conception of the practical tasks of social democracy. According to Bernstein, a general decline of capitalism seems to be increasingly improbable because, on one hand, capitalism shows a greater capacity of adaptation, and, on the other hand, capitalist production becomes more and more varied. The capacity of capitalism to adapt itself, says Bernstein, is manifested first, in the disappearance of general crises, resulting from the development of the credit system, employers' organizations, wider means of communication, and informational services. It shows itself, secondly, in the tenacity of the middle classes, which hails from the growing differentiation of the branches of production and the elevation of the vast layers of the proletariat to the level of the middle class. It is furthermore proved, argues Bernstein, by the amelioration of the economic and political situation of the proletariat as a result of its trade union activity. From this theoretic stand is derived the following general conclusion about the practical work in social democracy. The latter must not direct its daily activity towards the conquest of political power, but toward the betterment of the conditions of the working class within the existing order. It must not expect to institute socialism as a result of political and social crisis, but should build socialism by means of progressive extension of social control and the gradual application of the principle of cooperation. Bernstein himself sees nothing new in his theories. On the contrary, he believes them to be in agreement with certain declarations of Marx and Engels. Nevertheless, it seems to us that it is difficult to deny that they are in formal contradiction with the conceptions of scientific socialism. If Bernstein's revisionism merely consisted in affirming that the march of the capitalist development is slower than was thought before, he would merely be presenting an argument for adjourning the conquest of power by the proletariat, on which everybody agreed up to now. Its only consequence would be a slowing of the pace of the struggle. But that is not the case. What Bernstein questions is not the rapidity of the development of capitalist society, but the march of the development itself, and consequently, the very possibility of a change to socialism. Socialist theory, up to now, declared that the point of departure for a transformation to socialism would be a general and catastrophic crisis. We must distinguish in this outlook two things: the fundamental idea and its exterior form. The fundamental idea consists of the affirmation that capitalism, as a result of its own inner contradictions, moves towards a point when it will be unbalanced, when it will simply become impossible. Sound familiar? There were good reasons for conceiving that juncture in the form of a catastrophic general commercial crisis, but that is of a secondary importance when the fundamental idea is considered. The scientific basis of socialism rests, as is well known, on three principal results of capitalist development. First, on the growing anarchy of capitalist economy, leading inevitably to its ruin. Second, on the progressive socialization of the process of production, which creates the germs of the future social order. And third, on the increased organization and consciousness of the proletarian classes, which constitutes the active factor in the coming revolution. Bernstein pulls away from the first of the three fundamental supports of scientific socialism. He says that the capitalist development does not lead to a general economic collapse. He does not merely reject a certain form of the collapse, he rejects the very possibility of collapse. He says textually, quote, "One could claim that the collapse of the present society is meant something else than a general commercial crisis, worse than all others. That is, a complete collapse of the capitalist system brought about by the result of its own contradictions. And to this he replies, quote, with the growing development of society, a complete and almost general collapse of the present system of production becomes more and more improbable because capitalist development increases on the one hand the capacity of adaptation, and on the other hand, that is at the same time the differentiation of industry. But then the question arises, why and how, in that case, can we attain the final goal? According to scientific socialism, the historic necessity of the socialist revolution manifests itself above all in the growing anarchy of capitalism, which drives the system into an impasse. But if one admits with Bernstein that capitalist development does not move in the direction of its own ruin, then socialism ceases to be objectively necessary. There remain the other two mainstays of the scientific explanation of socialism, which are also said to be consequences of capitalism itself: the socialization of the process of production and the growing consciousness of the proletariat. It is these two matters that Bernstein has in mind when he says, quote, the suppression of the theory of the collapse does not in any way deprive socialist doctrine of the power of persuasion, for, examine closely, what are all the factors enumerated by that for the suppression of the modification of the former crisis? Nothing else, in fact, than the conditions, or even in party the germs, of the socialization of production of exchange. Very little reflection is needed to understand that here too we face a false conclusion. Where lies the importance of all the phenomena that are said by Bernstein to be the means of the capitalist adaptation? Cartels, the credit system, the development of the means of communication, the amelioration of the situation of the working class. Now, I just want to pause briefly. And when she references cartels, she's not just referencing drug cartels. Specifically, she's not specifically referencing drug cartels. She is referencing capitalist cartels of companies unified together under a overarching oppressive structure. Like IG Farben was a German capitalist pharmaceutical cartel that enabled things like camps like Auschwitz to operate efficiently. Sorry, I mean there was a certain degree of violent efficiency in Auschwitz that was enabled by IG Farben. which was then, if you've been paying attention to the stuff I say on social media, IG Farben was split up after the Nuremberg trials. IG Farben, again, the cartel, was split up during the Nuremberg trials, way after this was written, and turned into companies like Bayer, which just purchased Monsanto, and the like. So they still write the germs in this language of IG Farben still exist today and are very much extremely powerful. So we'll start out over with that. Very little reflection is needed to understand that here too we face a false conclusion. Where lies the importance of all the phenomena that are said by Bernstein to be the means of capitalist adaptation? Cartels, the credit system, the development of means of communication, the amelioration of the situation of the working class, etc. Obviously, in that they suppress or at least accentuate the internal contradictions of a capitalist economy and stop the development or the aggravation of these contradictions. Thus, the suppression of crises can only mean the suppression of antagonism between the production and exchange on the capitalist base. The amelioration of the situation of the working class or the penetration of certain fractions of the class into middle layers can only mean the attenuation of the antagonism between capital and labor. But if the mentioned factors suppress the capitalist contradiction and consequently save the system from ruin, if they enable capitalism to maintain itself, and that is why Bernstein calls them, quote, means of adaptation, how can cartels, the credit system, trade unions, etc., be at the same time, quote, the conditions and even in part the germs, end quote, of socialism? Obviously, only in the sense that they express most clearly the social character of production. I'm gonna go back and Google some words. Again, I'm pretty sure I know what these mean, but I want to be extremely clear. We're going to Google amelioration again because I'm exhausted. I'm on a really extreme diet involving ketosis, and normally I have tons of energy because of that, but right now I don't. So amelioration is the act of making something better, improvement. And the other word I wanted to Google was it began with an A. It was not amelioration, though. It was something to do with attenuation. Okay. Attenuation. I spelled that wrong. Fuck. We have to have our definitions extremely correct here because not doing that leads to theoretical misunderstandings that can create catastrophically incorrect opinions. Attenuation is the reduction of the force, effect, or value of something. So, yeah, kind of like the opposite of amelioration. Okay, maybe we should read that paragraph again. Very little reflection is needed to understand that here too we face a false conclusion. Where lies the importance of all phenomena that are said by Bernstein to be the means of capitalist adaptation? Cartels, the credit system, the development of the means of communication, the amelioration of the situation of the working class, etc. Obviously, in that they suppress or at least attenuate the internal contradictions of the capitalist economy and stop the development of the aggravation of these contradictions. Thus, the suppression of crises can only mean the suppression of the antagonism between production and exchange on the capitalist base. The amelioration of the situation of the working class or the penetration of certain fractions of the class into middle layers can only mean the attenuation of the antagonism between capital and labor. But if the mentioned factors suppress the capitalist contradictions and consequently save the system from ruin, if they enable capitalism to maintain itself, and that is why Bernstein calls them, quote, means of adaptation, end quote, how can cartels, the credit system, trade unions, etc., be at the same time, quote, the conditions and even in part the germs, end quote, of socialism? Obviously, only in the sense that they express most clearly the social character of production. Continuing, but by presenting it in its capitalist form, the same factors render superfluous. Inversely, in the same measure, the transformation of this socialized production into socialist production. I'm going to restart that in a second after I Google superfluous again. I think I know what it means, but I want to be absolutely clear with my language. Superfluous. Unnecessary, especially through being more than enough. Okay, so we're going to start that a little bit over. But by presenting in its capitalist form, the same factors render superfluous inversely in the same measure the transformation of this socialized production into socialist production. This is why they can be the germs or conditions of a socialist order only in a theoretic sense and not in a historic sense. They are phenomena which, in the light of our conception of socialism, we know to be related to socialism, but which, in fact, not only do not lead to a socialist revolution, but render it, on the contrary, superfluous. There remains one force making for socialism, the class consciousness of the proletariat. There remains one force making for socialism, the class consciousness of the proletariat. Right, so we have to raise the class consciousness of the proletariat, the working class. But it too is, in the given case, not the simple intellectual reflection of the growing contradictions of capitalism and its approaching decline. It is now more than an ideal whose force of persuasion rests only on the perfection attributed to it. And this is a free transcribed book, so occasionally there's like letters missing from words. There was one above where there was a D missing at the end, and there's one here where there's a T missing. So if I pause briefly and try to move my eyes around a lot, it's because I'm trying to figure out what form that word is supposed to be. So reading that again, there remains one force making for socialism, the class consciousness of the proletariat, but it too is, in the given case, not the simple intellectual reflection of the growing contradictions of capitalism and its approaching decline. It is now no more than an ideal whose force of persuasion rests on the perfection attributed to it. We have here, in brief, the explanation of the socialist program by means of, quote, pure reason. We have here, to use simpler language, an idealist explanation of socialism, the objective necessity of socialism, the explanation of socialism as the result of the material development of society, falls to the ground. Revisionist theory thus places itself in a dilemma. Either the socialist transformation is, as was admitted up to now, the consequence of the eternal contradictions of capitalism, and with the growth of capitalism will develop its inner contradictions, resulting inevitably at some point in its collapse. In that case, the quote means of adaptation are ineffective and the theory of collapse is correct. Or the quote means of adaptation, end quote, will really stop the collapse of the capitalist system and thereby enable capitalism to maintain itself by suppressing its own contradictions. In that case, socialism ceases to be a historic necessity and then becomes anything you want to call it, but it is no longer the result of the material development of society. It's unscientific. Unscientific is a part I added myself. That's not in the text. That was just my internal commentary. The dilemma leads to another. Either revisionism is correct in its position on the course of capitalist development, and therefore the socialist transformation of society is only a utopia, or socialism is not a utopia, and the theory of, quote, means of adaptation is false. There's the question in a nutshell. Let's see how long chapter 2 is and how long we've been streaming. Oh, wow, it's already been 34 minutes. Ooh, well, I gotta say, guys, team, folks, whoever you are, I'm very tired. I've been tired all day. I did not sleep well last night. So it's been 34 minutes. We've done the introduction of Reform or Revolution and chapter 1. Tomorrow we should do chapter 2. That being said, power of the people, workers of the world unite.